So for our presentation today, Cindy and I will talk about what motivated this paper entitled Techniques of Use, Confronting Value Systems of Productivity, Progress, and Usefulness in Computing and Design. We really started thinking about usefulness as we came out of 3 years of being embedded as researchers in Precarity Lab. Precarity Lab was funded by the Humanities Collaboratory, an initiative at the University of Michigan aimed at making humanistic scholarship competitive via models of acceleration. We began reflecting on how these demands are not unlike what we saw in our research sites in Indonesia and China.
We turned towards the work of philosopher and feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed, who had just came out with a new book called What's the Use? Ahmed shows how use became a moral obligation dating back to the periods of Western colonization with the construction of useful bodies in the colonies and amongst the working class in the West. She argues that value systems of usefulness have endured and show up in various corners of life today.
Exactly. And then the paper really focuses on HCI's techniques of use. So by techniques of use, we refer to HCI's value systems of usefulness. The idea that technology is inherently an enabler of social and human progress, of productivity and excellence, and how does value systems of usefulness governs the field and shapes what is designed, who gets published, and what is considered a valid contribution.
We focus specifically on how the imperative to make oneself useful overworks, exhausts, and exploits some more than the others. Those deemed unfit, useless, or unable are caught up in the sheer endless loop of self-improvement and feelings of hope, envy, anger, and despair.
So let me give you an example of how this surfaced in my research in the manufacturing city, Shenzhen in China. I spent several years following some of the young to middle-aged men employed in Shenzhen's manufacturing industry. They had left behind a life in agriculture, following the promise that embedding themselves into Shenzhen's experiments with high-tech futures might give them a way out of a life that seemed stuck in the countryside. One of them was Liang Zhang, who had, so to say, come of age via Shenzhen's production networks. I met him in a newly established incubator space. His job at the incubator, however, was quite different from his work in the manufacturing industry. It was unpaid. It was a form of entrepreneurial labor that was deemed useful by the Chinese Party state and its ambitions to build up an indigenous innovation economy that would free China from colonial stereotypes of China as lacking. Men like Liang accepted overwork and even no pay in order to be at last seen as productive and useful citizens who China can be proud of.
Right, and in Indonesia, senior government officials who engage in petty corruption have often been portrayed as slow and ineffective by international development agencies such as the IMF. Many junior engineers who I worked with during my fieldwork in Indonesia's National Innovation and Research Agency wanted to be seen instead as useful and different from this generation of corrupt senior officials. Hence, they, like Liang from Shenzhen, aspired to a different kind of work ethic and one that drew from contemporary computing and design methods. This included contracting IBM to coach the agency in time management techniques that celebrate agility and flexibility. Junior engineers saw these methods as an opportunity to intervene in Indonesia's corrupt past, thought to hold the country back from being modern. In sum, the adoption of agile techniques allowed junior engineers to distinguish themselves from senior colleagues, while old and new forms of paternalistic structures continue to exist.
So just to provide a couple of takeaways, in the paper we show how methods from agile software development that Cindy talked about to entrepreneurial tech production that I mentioned earlier in the case of Shenzhen are violent techniques of use. We show how those framed as lacking, shaped by racialized, colonial, and disciplinary tropes of the other, get caught up in a vicious cycle of desiring what they are denied. In this process, we argue, resistance and solidarity become less possible.
We propose to attend to histories of the field in HCI that do not feel so good. For instance, the field's structural racism and its evaluation matrix that promote quantity and productivity. Our aim in this paper is to stick with and begin from, rather than overcome, the so-called negative. Critique does at times produce feelings of unease and discomfort, but that's exactly its purpose, to open up what we can imagine. Indeed, the most hopeful aspects of technology research and design today are recent calls to attend to its racist, sexist, ableist, heteronormative, and exploitative structures. And here we are thinking about specific incidents that have happened to junior scholars who were fired for calling out anti-Blackness in the scholarly community of HCI, the firing of Tim McGrew and Margaret Mitchell from the ethical AI team in Google, and the continued efforts by BIPOC scholars to call for greater recognition in HCI and computing. We dedicate this paper to them. Thank you.